Okay, well, again, because most of you have probably sat in on trainings or that I've done before, I'm not going to go through my background and everything other than say that I worked for child welfare in this state for a long time, and then I was at the School of Social Work and worked for Casey Family Program. So anyway, a long background in child welfare. So one of my interests in a lot, I've done, of course, a lot of training for caseworkers in this state and over the years, and I stopped doing that last year, last spring, after doing training for 8 years. Well, several years ago, I did a round of trainings in this state and in some other states as well on reunification, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So this is a big, and by the way, at any point in which you want to interject or make a comment or put a question in the chat box or whatever it is, I'll try to respond to that. And if I don't get around responding during this hour, I'll respond afterwards. Or also, I'll give you an email address where you can contact me directly if you have a question. So I guess the first thing to say is that reunification is actually one of the most studied subjects in child welfare. So child welfare is a very peculiar thing in a way because there are some very important subjects that have had for whatever reason, very little research about them. And so almost everything that is done in child welfare or is promoted as best practice or whatever, and that's really based on practice wisdom. And that's a lot of different things. I mean, so for example, if you're talking about in-home safety planning, there's very little research in the last 20, 30 years, even 20, 25 years at least on that particular subject. So as important as it is, there's not a research basis there for whatever agencies are doing, but there is, of course, practice wisdom, which is hard-earned. You learn lessons through sometimes very painful experiences, right? But what's different about reunification is that it's been so well studied compared to so many other subjects in child welfare. And this has been true for not just recently, but for decades. And so there really is a lot of information here. Now, several years ago, maybe when I worked for Casey Family Program from 2010 to 2016, the first part of 2016. And at one point during that period of time, I went back because I had the time to do it. I went back and looked at the sort of the total, so to speak, volume of research that had been done on reunification. And this would have been in 2015, something like that. Well, I found 700 studies that had been done over 30 to 40 years then, and not talking about what's been done since 2015. And there had been, of course, a lot of subsequent studies done in the last decade. So, the interesting thing about those studies was out of all those hundreds of studies, there probably weren't more than 10 or 12 that were randomized controlled trials. That is, in which one intervention is matched with business as usual or with another intervention, and there's randomized assignment to a control group and experimental group, and then people compare, someone compares the outcome. Very few studies like that, but a lot of studies based on very large administrative data sets. A lot of studies of programs. There have been a lot of programs that have been developed to support reunification and over a long period of time. So two different kind of areas to this subject, and I'm going to talk about one of them today, but the two areas are, one of them are criteria for safe reunification. And that's what we're going to talk about today at some length here. And then the other has to do with supports for reunification. And obviously that is the kind of resources that are helpful in making reunification safe and lasting as opposed to kids reentering care. Now, I think I've done in a past training, I may have mentioned that, a recent research study, and I mean something published with, if I say recent, something published within the last five years or so, found that nationally, with a national sample, thousands of cases, the reentry into care rate for all ages in this particular study was 27%. So, which means that 27% of the kids who had been reunified with a parent out of a dependency. So that's the other thing we're talking about today. We're talking about reunifications out of legal structure, not reunifications broadly speaking, because a lot of kids go back home within a very few days of placement. So we're not talking about those kids. We're talking about the kids for whom become legally dependent, like in this state, and after some months or sometimes, a year and a half or two, or even longer sometimes, the kids go back home, right? So looking at those kids in that national sample, and I'm not even sure that included Washington, but the reentry into care rate was a little over 25%. But the most concerning part was that the reunification rate for infants was 36%. So more than 1 in 3 infants who were reunified out of dependency were coming back into care within about a year or two's time. So that was a very, of all the findings in that study on reentry, that's the one that concerned me the most, because of course, a lot of kids going into care are in fact infants. About 1 in 5 kids going into foster care, both in this state and nationally, are 0 to 1 at the time that they enter care. So to have 1 in 3 of those kids, coming back into care within about a year or two time, that was a very concerning stat, and it very much represented a challenge to my thinking. So just to tell you where I have been, and I have just written a sounding board that I sent out last month on this particular subject. That is, for years now, for a long time, for probably 20 years, I have been a proponent of the idea that we can safely increase reunification rates. I'm not saying that reunification as it's done, both in this state and nationally, is generally safe. I'm not making any statement like that for reasons that I'm going to say again. But what I'm saying is that we have the potential to increase safe reunifications if we do the right things. And again, remember, this is a very, very well-studied subject. And in addition, of course, agencies just have hundreds of thousands, millions of examples of their efforts to engage in safe reunification, right? So we have a large body of experience to deal with here. So one of the things I want to say about these studies, and then I'll go on to some practical stuff here, is that to talk about reunification in the abstract, just like to talk about foster care in the abstract, that's a very unreal kind of thing. I mean, because you can have a study, for example, I read yesterday a study of reunification in Rhode Island that was published in 2009. It was based on data that was gathered, on kids who went back to families from 2001 to 2004. To take that study published 15 years ago based on 25-year-old data and generalize its findings to what's going on in Washington today, that's really highly questionable. And that's what I mean to say that reunification is abstraction. So it's reunification under what specific circumstances, in what state, at what time, with what resources, with what practices, with what follow-up. And so that's what we're talking about today, to try to what can we do in a concrete way to make reunification safer, because we all know that it can be done unsafely. And a lot of times it has been done unsafely, both in this state and in other states. So first and foremost, you want to do something that's very, very dangerous in reunification practice. The first thing, and the studies have found that this goes on in lots of states, you can have judicial officers and other decision makers like yourself who have persons who have an influence on decision making. You can be primarily basing a reunification decision on whether a family has complied with a court order. So kids are made legally dependent. Parents are mandated to engage in various services. And so there's a way of viewing this as almost like playing a legal game. And the legal game is called compliance. And so you come back into court a few months later, and the court reviews, and everyone reviews the extent to which a parent has followed faithfully and literally a court order. And that court order might be to enter in and complete substance abuse treatment or parenting skills classes, or do a variety of other things. And so it's possible then to make reunification decisions pretty much simplified in a simplified way we're just going to look at whether parents did what the court ordered them to do. And if they did it, we're going to view that as a proxy for safety. And if they didn't do it, we're going to view that as a proxy for danger. Well, both from the standpoint of practice wisdom and from the standpoint of research, that is a very dangerous way to make reunification decisions. But courts, a lot of times, and a lot of times, particularly public defenders, they really want a simplified decision-making structure like that, in which the rules of the game are extremely clear to all the parties involved, and it can come down to simply showing that a parent has done what the court ordered or they haven't done it. But again, to say this again, when courts do this in a systematic way, and this is the way they make decisions, lots of kids are going to get hurt and some kids are going to get killed because this is not a rational, reasonable way of making decisions. Of course, we're not interested just in whether parents have complied with court orders. We're interested in the results of treatment. I mean, what has been the outcome of treatment, not just whether parents have done it and completed treatment. So one of the findings, for example, over the years has been in past years that not more than 50% of parents mandated to engage in substance abuse treatment within a juvenile court setting were actually doing it. Not more than 50%. So why did we end up in situations so often that we were faced with a decision between, parents who hadn't complied with court orders and they hadn't completed a substance abuse treatment program. And now because of AFSA timelines, we're thinking about a termination of parental rights and adoption and so on, so it's even in those instances where parents a lot of times have complied with a court order, they really may have not changed anything at all. There have been a couple of studies from years past. I mean, one of these studies is pretty old, but it had a very disturbing message, which was that a lot of parents just admitted to the researchers that they never really stopped using at all, despite the fact that they were in a substance abuse treatment program. So even people, they were just able to scam the program. So there just cannot be any assumption that because someone has done X, Y, and Z in terms of a court order, that the hoped for result has occurred. And of course, if you think about then, well, given the fact that most of these kids have been in placement for at least months, sometimes for a year or two, sometimes for even longer, and they've interacted with parents in very supervised, usually supervised, very controlled settings, how would we be making a decision, a rational decision on whether once this child went back into the full-time care of this parent, that child was going to be safe? What would be a rational basis for saying that? And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit now, right? So now I've had occasionally, I used to do this training for judicial officers in this state, and I don't mean just judges, commissioners, also for CASAs and other people. And occasionally a judicial officer would say to me that according to the law, what the law says is once the factors that led to placement are remedied, then kids have to be returned to parents, right? And so, and thinking of it in that way, what the judge or commissioner was saying a lot of times, if a child was placed in care because of substance abuse and we have reason to believe that the parent's no longer abusing substances, then we're going to take that as a proxy for safety. But I guess what I'm saying is it's not a proxy for safety. Sometimes when parents stop using, kids are at increased risk of harm rather than decreased risk of harm. So there have to be some other way well, so what are the behaviors that we're looking for then that would be rational and usable proxies for safety when we're making those judgments about kids who have been in care for, a lengthy period of time? And so before I go any further with that, let me stop and see if you have a comment or question here. Okay, so one of the lessons from a lot of the research, I would say if you looked at a lot of research studies on reunification from maybe 1970 to 2000, early 2000s or something, probably the main lesson from that research was that the main predictor of reunification, and again, we're talking about not how things ought to be, but how they actually were. The main predictor of reunification was the visitation record in that early research. And so again, I want you to think for a second about, well, why would that be true? Not, in other words, necessarily compliance with the treatment plan, but the visitation record. So I want you to think for a second, and there have been so various, a couple of different ways of understanding this particular finding. And I favor one of those ways over another, but it's totally a personal opinion. So I want you to think for a second about, well, why would the visitation record be as important as it seemed to be in that early research from the standpoint of whether a court was going to agree to a reunification? Thoughts on that?
Go ahead, John.
Well, it establishes the parent-child bond and whether or not during the visitations that bond has been preserved and in some cases maybe enhanced by the quality and frequency of the visitation, if that answers Dee's
Yeah,
question.
so partly it's a reflective of the strength of the parent-child connection. And it also is a reflection and therefore of the motivation of the parent to be a parent. And so, and this is my particular, now I want to say this is an interpretation, my own, not just mine, but other people, some scholars, that I view the importance of visitation as a proxy for the motivation of a parent to be a parent. And I also strongly agree with the idea that the visitation record a lot of times is very reflective of the degree of connection that the parent has for the child there. Now, the other way of interpreting this is that, and that some courts have done in this state, is to view the visitation, the frequency of visitation as sort of a causative factor. That is, the more that parents visit children, the more likely they are that bond between parent and child is to be strengthened. And so the visitation is a way of strengthening, and particularly for very young children, for infants, for example, who enter care in the first few months of life. That is, imagine the difference between a parent who's visiting once a week and a parent who's visiting a child in the foster home several times a week. Imagine so this isn't exactly, I guess, an either or thing. You can say, well, it could be some of both, right? But particularly when you're talking about issues particularly related to substance abuse, then one of the first things we want to be assessing in terms of making a reunification decision is, what is the nature of the parent's motivation to be a parent here? And not just primarily based on their verbal statements, but based on their behavior. So that's the importance of the visitation record here. So what I want you to do for a second is to think about, well, how else might you or might we assess the motivation of someone to do anything at all? Whether that is to be a parent or to engage in, to lose weight, to give up smoking, to do anything that's kind of difficult. What would be some of the indicators of motivation to actually do that? How would we know that someone is motivated to do that? And so just think about from your life experience or from the experience you've had as a CASA or in child welfare, what would be some other indicators apart from whether the parent has visited the child on a regular basis? Anyway, any thoughts there?
Perhaps participating in like medical care, um, participating in hearings, wanting to find out what's going on with the kiddo.
Yeah, I mean, I think the extent to which parents reach out. So again, think about, well, what if someone in your family had a child in foster care, and think about your degree of interest in that child? Say you had a strong connection to that child. I mean, if you have a strong connection to the child, the likelihood is you're going to take a strong interest in what's going on in that child's life. And sometimes that can mean that a parent it can become very much of a persistent pest to caseworkers or to foster parents, but at the same time, there's a very active interest in what's happening in relationship to this child, both in the quality of care and how the child is doing, say, within a school system or in preschool or in mental health treatment or in as far as their medical issues and problems go. So taking an active interest in anything, of course, is a sign of motivation. Another common sign of motivation is the willingness to stick with something in the face of obstacles. So particularly when something is very hard to do, something is very challenging to do, and it takes a lot of effort and it takes sacrifice. The willingness to continue to do that, to overcome and to struggle with whatever those challenges are, no matter how difficult. That again is another sign of motivation in life to do anything at all. If someone can be very easily defeated quickly in a commitment to, say, a New Year's resolution or a commitment to do something different in a marriage or an intimate relationship or whatever, if someone after a week or two, because of a setback or something, so again, so signs, an active interest in how the child is doing in care, and that means the willingness to reach out on a regular kind of a basis to find out and to try to be a positive, not just a sort of a persistent pest there, but to try to be someone who is actually helpful in resolving whatever those issues and challenges are. To be persistent in the face of challenges. And of course, one of those challenges in substance abuse is the likelihood of relapse. And so this is kind of one of the important indicators of what happens after relapses, which are, if not 100%, certainly going to happen in a large percentage of the cases where there is a substance abuse issue. What's a parent's response to relapse? Is it to be totally defeated in their commitment to treatment, or is it that they recommit to recovery? And that's always the question when you're dealing with relapse here. It's always what's going to be the person's response to that relapse, whether that would be in response to anything having to do with an addiction or with some kind of practice that someone has come to depend on, even though it has very adverse effects on health and on physical health and on mental health as well. Now, one other kind of indicator very quickly here is that every once in a while, something will happen in foster care where clearly a parent, and sometimes even a foster parent, has to decide between doing something that's important to them and doing something on behalf of a child, when those two things are not the same thing. So, for example, understanding the need, for example, occasionally to cancel a visit because of a child's illness, or to change the circumstances of a visit because of a child's reactions. So again, what we're judging there a lot of the times is the extent to which a caregiving kind of person is really concerned about the child as opposed to their interest in the child or their possession of the child or even their relationship with the child. The ability every once in a while to see the child's interest as separate from their interest. In the same way that we judge a lot of times the quality of love. Love can be any kind of love, extremely selfish. It can be extremely possessive. And it can be selfless. And so every once in a while, this kind of thing cannot be planned, but every once in a while incidents occur where someone gives an indication of the extent to which they're capable of selfless love. Or at least they're putting the child's interest first before their interest. Again, as a sign of motivation. Now, I would say that with the substance abusing group of people, this is almost the most important of the criteria for reunification, because what we seems like to me we want to see in substance abuse is that it's not so much sobriety in and of itself, it's putting the child's interest over the power and importance of the drug, the alcohol, the drugs, whatever it is. So it's kind of reversing the value scheme. So lots of times parents who have addictions, a lot of those parents, they love their kids deeply. It's just that they need the drug more. It's not that they don't love their kids, it's just that they have a physical and emotional and a psychological need that just, so to speak, trumps that caring for the child. So what we want to see in those instances is we want to see more than sobriety itself, we want to see a reversal of this value scheme. So that even, for example, in the case of relapse, a parent would put the child's interest first. And what that would mean concretely is that they would be doing things about sort of causing a minimum of harm there, sort of a harm reduction kind of approach here. For example, making arrangements for the care of a child if a parent is on a binge. Doing something that shows forethought, the willingness or the commitment to taking steps to prevent harm. That would be, again, a sign of motivation there. So before I go, and this is the most, even if we get all these other criteria I'm going to talk about here in a minute, even if we get these other criteria wrong, if we get this criteria right in terms of the assessment, then there's a very, very good chance that lots of reunifications are going to work out. Even if the parents lack skills, if they lack resources, if they lack social support, all these things I want to talk about here in a minute. If the motivation is strong, and there's a strong commitment to doing right by this kid, and that comes before the need to service an addiction, then the likelihood is that a reunification is going to be safe. So let me stop there and see if you have comments or questions here. Okay, so these reunification criteria, years ago, I created an acronym for this, and the acronym was MERS. And so M, the letter M stands obviously for motivation. So followed by 3 E's. And the E's, the first E is experience. And that means not just whether parents visit, not just the visitation record, but what goes on in the visitation. That is, and particularly is there a quality of enjoyment, of playfulness, of joy, of affection? Is that a part of the visitation? Not that it's going to be ever solely that, because of course child care is really hard. Child care is really challenging. And particularly when kids who have they might have disabilities or physical health problems or behavioral health problems, don't expect parenting to be fun all the time or even most of the time. But at the same time, particularly the thing it seems like to me we ought to be looking for in visits, insofar as we are observing those, and I want to say something more about that here in just a second. A lot of times we're looking for that quality of enjoyment. Is there a period where both the parent and child seem to be enjoying one another's company, as opposed to that being just kind of like a little bit of an adverse kind of experience, or possibly even a misery? A lot of times when parents cannot manage and control behavior and they seem sort of at a loss, or even when they're trying to control their behavior in the presence of an observer or a supervisor or something like that, right? So for this reason, it is of great value if visitations are set up in the most natural way possible. And I think I said this the last time, but I want to say this again. Sometimes visits between parents and kids after a removal, they'll start off in an office for obvious reasons. There'll be a supervisor, maybe there'll be a visitation center. At some point, you want to evolve out of that. You want to evolve out of a visitation arrangement that has to be supervised at all moments, and where someone is sitting there with a pen and paper. I mean, what a weird idea. If someone is going to sit there recording what happens during play and everything, right? At some point, you want to get something that's more natural, so to speak, and for longer periods of time, and without having to be supervised at all moments. And still, there can be brief periods of observation where, again, what you're looking for is the amount of sort of reciprocal affection and enjoyment that's going on in that parent-child interaction kind of thing there. And of course, that can be a very painful thing for a parent if you have a child, for example, who was placed with in a foster home when the child was a few months old, never really even attached to the birth parent, and who clearly thinks, experiences the foster parent as their psychological parent, and is uncomfortable sometimes in the presence of a parent. So one of the things that we can do a lot of times, particularly when parents are having difficulties in these interactions, instead of just making sort of an adverse judgment about it, one of the kind of very useful supports and interventions we can use there is some kind of parent coaching to help increase the quality of the visits there. Instead of, so to speak, just making a negative judgment about a parent's ability to interact with their child, to try to help them to do something that makes that interaction a more enjoyable type of experience there. And so occasionally in the past, I would have a judge or commissioner, when I would do these kind of trainings, would say to me, well, they could see that was important, but how was that had anything to do with child safety? But it has everything to do with child safety. It has everything to do with child safety. Imagine a situation in which a parent and child never experience any kind of, affection, pleasure, enjoyment from their interaction. How can a child be safe in that circumstance? So before I go further, let me stop here and see if you have comments or questions about issues related to the quality of visitation.
This is coming up a lot. There's one question: is psychological safety included in the definition of safety?
Well, of course it is with me. Now, of course, I've written, some of you know, I write these commentaries called Sounding Board that I do every month. And so within the last several months, I've written 2,300 word commentaries on child safety issues. And so, yes, psychological safety is a component of safety, even though sometimes it doesn't seem like child welfare agencies are taking that into account. Of course, it ought to be taken into account. So I guess the short answer is yes. And so I guess the more important issue a lot of times would be, well, what would be an indicator of psychological safety, or what would be an indicator of not feeling safe? And so for the very little kids, of course, those indicators are going to be nonverbal mainly. And a lot of times that, of course, can be painful. So I mentioned before, the sort of the classic indicator of stranger anxiety in these research experiments, and this is over a period of many decades, a famous experiment where you bring a child into a child is in the presence of a parent, and then you bring a stranger into the room, and then the point of the whole experiment is to observe, well, how does the child react in the presence of a stranger? And so if the child is securely attached, then the child goes to the caregiver for comfort, stays a little close to the caregiver until they feel comfortable with the stranger, at which point they can reach out to the stranger, or they can allow more proximity to the stranger. So the stranger anxiety experiment is a sort of one well-founded, well-researched way, and at least in therapy, to find out how a child actually feels about a parent. And of course, this can be a very painful thing if clearly the a young child doesn't feel that a parent is their secure base, right? And so just to remind, what some of these attachment styles are, the most common one being insecure attachment, where a child is clearly, in the presence of a stranger, for example, would not move toward the caregiver because their life experience has been that the caregiver perhaps is not a trustworthy person, or they don't even know the caregiver all that well. And so that's a sign of insecure attachment. And of course, there's ambivalent attachment where a child stays very close to, whoever the caregiver is. They're afraid to be out of the presence of the caregiver. That's not secure attachment. That's ambivalent attachment. And finally, sort of the disorganized attachment where kids don't even have an organized attachment style. They might be at one point clinging to a parent, and the next moment they might be attacking the parent, trying to harm the parent or whatever. So now, again, I'm not saying that looking at or observing a child's attachment style is the only way of making judgments about how kids feel relative to safety with that caregiver, but it's one obvious way. And it is, of course, something that can be taught because there is a lot of research on this particular subject and a lot of writing on this particular subject. So if you're looking at any of, for example, of Deborah Gray's books on trauma-informed care, I mentioned the books Nurturing Adoptions, Attachment and Adoption. She's going to have a description of, and as are lots of other books on attachment about, how do you observe these attachment styles? And there's only 3 or 4 of them to know and to be able to recognize them, right? Now, I've had a few things happen over the years, just to say, where, you don't have to be a genius to figure something out. I mean, at one point, years ago, on behalf of a peer of mine, I made a visit to a family that we had worked with for a really long time, and on behalf of one child. And while I was there, the parent went out of the room, and this little child, who was no more than 4 or 5 years old, immediately moves close to me, and she says in very distinct words, "Help me," and with anguish on her face, right? I didn't have to speculate about how that child felt in that circumstance. That child was afraid of her mother and was asking that someone help her. And she was couldn't have been more than 5, something like that. So sometimes kids are going to tell you very overtly by their behavior. Other times they're not. So I want to say a little bit here about skills, because the issue there a lot of times, of course, in the mandated court order plans, is that those plans tend to have a combination of, for example, if parents have a substance abuse issue, well, obviously a parent is going to be mandated to engage in substance abuse treatment. And then at some point along the way, the parent is going to be mandated to be involved in skills training. And some kind of a hopefully evidence-based practice around, again, how to enhance the quality of interaction with their child and how to manage unwanted child behavior. That would be another example of, so issues around how to coordinate, the use of skill-based programs and programs related to substance abuse and or mental health treatment. That has been an issue for years and years. I think the short version of the research here is that there's no right answer to what ought to come first here. And there's no right answer to, you should always start off with substance abuse treatment, and then and then once a parent has achieved some level of sobriety, then follow with skills-based training, or do it the opposite way. This turns out to be highly idiosyncratic. Some parents can benefit from skill-based trainings while they are in substance abuse training, in substance abuse treatment. Other parents cannot. Some parents do have to achieve a level of sobriety before they can benefit from a skill-based training kind of program. So again, one of the criteria that we're going to want to apply, hopefully, to reunification decisions is to what point has the parent acquired skills for managing unwanted child behavior and for enhancing the quality of their interaction with their baby, their young child, or their school-age child. So to what extent have they acquired skills? And the skills is back to the mirrors thing, and that's sort of the S in the acronym kind of thing, right? And so a lot of the programs really have to do, a lot of the mandated court orders are kind of combinations of these two things. There's a therapeutic component and there's a skill-based component. And a lot of times courts are looking at compliance issues relative to the therapeutic component. And then hopefully we're looking at actually the skills acquired in terms of the skill-based component. And so again, the main challenge to all skills acquisition, this isn't just in child welfare, but in every area of life, is that under stress, people tend to lose the skills that they most recently acquired. So for example, if a parent, for example, had a lot of trouble in calming their baby, and then there was some kind of a parent coaching kind of a program that helped them to understand through the use of touch and cuddling and motion and rocking, how to calm a crying baby. And then they're put in a situation where they're under a lot of stresses in relation both to childcare and economically and so forth. What happens a lot of times is that the skills that are most recently acquired are the skills that are most suddenly lost. And so what we want to know in terms of skill-based training is whether people are going to retain the use of skills under stress and pressure, not just whether they understand in terms of behavior how to utilize the skill, but when challenged, when pressed, they can use it under pressure. I want to come back to the E's. I mentioned the issue around sort of the issue of a experience, the extent to which a parent-child interaction is enjoyable or not. So particularly with the neglecting parents, the parents who, and by the way, in terms of chronic neglect, there's always an underlying chronically relapsing condition there. Usually it's substance abuse, not always. Sometimes it can be a mental health condition, either in combination with a substance abuse disorder or rather than, or some kind of trauma-based reaction to violence based on a history of domestic violence. For those parents, a lot of the dynamics that goes into chronic neglect, as I've mentioned in these trainings before, has to do with issues of learned helplessness. And a lot of times what's happening in those cases is that parents are gradually losing the ability to control their lives in every respect. That is, they cannot control their addiction. That's almost true by definition. That means they cannot, they have lost control over behaviors that affect their physical health. They're very often, usually very, very poor. And so they have a limited ability to manage their housing, their neighborhoods, their transportation, all of that stuff. They a lot of times have lost touch with their social support groups. And so anyway, and so the ability to just do the things that it takes to survive in the world, those kind of abilities are compromised. And that is particularly true when you're talking about people who have co-occurring disorders and kids are in foster care due to chronic neglect or some combination of neglect and abuse. So one of the things we want to be looking at here is the extent to which persons in treatment programs have regained their ability to do things on their own behalf. And so I call that efficacy, and the sort of the lingo in the social work literature is self-efficacy. So, but to make the acronym work, I just, use the term efficacy, but it refers to both one's confidence in the ability to do things on one's own behalf and the skills, the ability to do it, both the confidence to do it and the ability to do it. And a lot of times we're talking about in relationship to the parents with kids in foster care, to do the things that it takes to survive in life. That is to acquire whatever the resources are that it takes to pay the rent, to put food on the table, to buy clothes for kids, to manage one's situation economically, and also to ask for help when one needs help, and particularly in relationship to managing the behavior of a child there. So that efficacy thing, and so that doesn't mean, by what I mean by self-efficacy here, I don't mean total self-sufficiency. I mean the ability to accurately assess one's need for help and when necessary to ask for help. So people who are competent in this world, they're not people who are totally self-sufficient. This is some crazy American myth thing, right? People who are competent in this world can assess their own abilities and know when they need help and ask for it and acquire it. So they can ask for help and they can give help. So, of course, the way most of us do that in life is that we do that through family relationships or through friendships that are reciprocal, in the sense that when people in our social network need help, we offer help. When we need help, we ask for help and we receive help. And that's what it means to have an actual workable social network there. So there have been in recent years some studies that have found, for example, in this country, half of people say that if they had an unexpected expense of $400 or more, there's no one in their social network that they could go to ask for it. Half of the people in this country saying that they couldn't borrow $400 if they had a need to fix their car. That's a dysfunctional society. A society that works like that, there's something deeply, deeply wrong, right? So what you want here then is for people who have, particularly low-income people, to be able to, again, to engage in sort of these alliances, these friendships, these connections with extended family members. And a lot of times, remember, the parents that we're dealing with, particularly the substance abusing families, they have alienated all those family members. And so one of the things that it means to sort of get better, so to speak, in a therapeutic sense, is that they begin to reestablish those ties with people who can be their support groups in life, people that they can reach out to for help with their children and help when they need it, right? So that's kind of the efficacy part of things. And it isn't real complicated a lot of times to figure it out. So it's not just whether people are sort of getting through treatment programs and going to treatment and so forth, though that is important. The other part of it is, are they doing normal, usual, everyday things on their own behalf to acquire the resources that they need, to make the social connections they need, to actually be a functional, effective person and parent in this world? And so that's kind of the efficacy side of things, right? So let me see where I've got here. I've gone through M is the motivation, E is the experience and visitation, E is efficacy, S is skills. And now I want to say a little bit about the resources kind of thing here. And I'm going to say more about that perhaps next month or the month after in training, because this is such a huge subject for child welfare systems. So if we want reunification to be more effective in general, that is, and concretely we mean to reunify kids with a lower reentry into care rate and with a lower rate of substantiated child maltreatment after kids go back to parents, then we're going to need a better sort of array of resources for those parents once kids go back into the family. And so a lot of times what those resources are very common sensey things. A lot of times they're poverty related resources, a lot of the time. So probably the best single book, at least for me, that I've read on reunification in many, many years is the Jill Barrick book, Take Me Home, which was published in 2007. So I recommend that book for anyone who works in child welfare, around child welfare, for causes for foster parents. And that book has in addition to being a very good scholarly summary of the research on various permanent planning issues as it existed at the time that book was published, it also has 6 case studies of women in California who had lost their kids due to drug problems, I think in all 6 cases, and had eventually gone back and been able to regain custody of their kids. And Barrick established relationships with those 6 women and were able to follow them throughout the course of the reunification process to find out the struggles, the challenges that they experienced, and what helped them, what didn't help. Well, the single most common finding was that the child welfare staff were just missing in action there. I mean, those women rarely had contact with any caseworkers once those kids went back into the families. No matter what the policy said about monthly visits or whatever it was, those caseworkers in California were not following those policies. So again, if we want parents to succeed at hard, challenging things, then clearly they're going to need emotional supports. And of course, it's very helpful then to live in communities where we have some kind of programs or resources that we can access, that we can reach out to, parents can reach out to, that is going to be able to do that. In theory, I always thought in the past that foster parents could be one of those resources. And yet I think I said last time that every effort that I ever made as a caseworker to make that happen subsequent to a reunification failed. You know, I was never able to make it happen, even though in theory, I thought it should happen 100% of the time. It almost never happened. I almost never could get a foster parent to be a respite care provider for a parent, and to have a parent actually call the foster parent to ask for help. I mean, in theory, that, you know, so in order to do something like that, to make that work, foster parents and birth parents have to have relationships that are not based on caseworker directives. That is, they become friends and somehow because they're involved in the joint care of kids or something. So parents need economic resources, and that's what Barrick found. They need social supports, which they rarely had, but what they mostly needed was they needed help with the economics of things. And they needed help with rent deposits, with being able to buy furniture, with diapers, with car repairs, just the kind of things that parents need a lot of times when kids don't go into foster care. Because why? Same reasons. Because you're dealing with basically a low income group of people, and a lot of times not just poor, severely poor, as I've mentioned in past trainings here. Now, one of the things I want to say that Barrick found that was maybe one of her most distressing findings about child safety is that in the absence of caseworkers being in regular contact with those kids and with those parents during the time that kids were in care and then post reunification, a lot of times if the kids were in relative care, the relatives just gave the kids back without caseworker permission or knowledge. So just the consequences of not being involved with people, not supporting people, not being in regular touch with people, is they just make their own decisions. And a lot of times the relatives would make, and it turns out some of the relatives were great. Sometimes the relatives had just as serious drug problems as the parents had. It's just that the agency didn't know about it, but the parent did know about it. So sometimes the kids just moved from kinship care to back to the parents' care without the agency ever even being involved there or knowing about it. So yeah, so it is important, the kind of supports that people receive post-reunification and pre-reunification. And of course, in this state and in most other states, that is greatly affected by the size of the community in which you live. I mean, I was the regional administrator in Region 6, where for a lot of times in some of those little places, little towns, there just basically there were not any resources. But if you went to Seattle or Tacoma or Olympia, places like that, well, there were I don't know what the status of that is today, but 15, 20 years ago, there were lots of resources to help parents in the post-reunification phase of things. And that ought to be an issue in the extent, in the timing, at least, of reunification there. So the more supports there are to support reunification, once it has already occurred, beginning in the trial placement area, the quicker reunification can happen. The less supports there are, the more we have to be sure that parents are very, very strong in their treatment program and are really able to cope with situations as challenges present themselves, because the community in which they live doesn't have anything for them. So that's the R in sort of the acronym. So the MEERS kind of thing, the MEERS kind of thing, as a sort of an acronym for the, you know, the criteria that we would use to sort of look at the child safety kind of issues there. Now, a couple more things I want to say here, particularly around issues related to behavior problems of kids. And this is true both in the, you know, so again, one of the reasons that, of course, the courts are rightly very insistent on skill-based programs being a part of court orders is that a lot of times the kids have become extremely oppositional. They may have all kind of emotion dysregulation issues that parents just have a lot of difficulty with, to say the least. And then on top of that, the school-age kids may have real grievances there. I mean, even though they may love their parents, they also may be very angry at them for the separation itself. for the drug issues themselves. And here I can say personally, I can speak from experience here, because during the school age, when I was a kid, I lived with a parent who had drug and alcohol issues. And over the years, of course, I became extremely upset and distressed and even very angry with that parent, to the point where I just basically wasn't going to listen to anything the parent told me. And so, because I didn't have any respect for her. So a lot of times what's going to happen is that parents are going to have a very great difficulty with managing the behavior problems, particularly of school-aged kids, once the honeymoon period is over in reunification. And that honeymoon period isn't going to last more than a couple of months, and usually a lot less than that. Once that honeymoon period is over, they are going to have difficulty managing the kids' behavior really a lot of the time. And so that is one of those kind of supports that we want there to be there. You know, help with the parent in managing the kids' oppositional kind of behavior, and particularly in managing their emotion regulation. That is, what if the kid is subject to meltdowns? Does a parent know how to manage that? So those are the sort of anyway, a few of my thoughts on the subject here. So one other thing I guess I want to mention, just because we have a minute or two here, is when we talk about the visitation arrangements, the way the agency thinks a lot of times is kids are in foster placement, and at some point we return the child to the home, and we call that a trial home placement. And then at some point the trial home placement becomes a reunification, and then at some point down the road we dismiss the legal action, and so that's a completed reunification and so forth, right? So that's sort of the legal structure of things. But what the therapeutic structure of things ought to be is that we gradually extend the degree or the length of visitation little by little, not sort of at one point the child is visiting a couple of hours, and then at the next point we're returning the child to the family and calling it a trial home visit. No, that's a misunderstanding. So, I mean, we need to follow visits of, several hours with overnights. We need to follow overnight visits with weekend visits. We need to follow weekend visits with visits for a few days or a week or so that we gradually ease into the situation while we're carefully assessing how the parent is coping with this once they have to deal with the child through both the fun times and the very, very difficult times. And I think it's 12 o'clock, and maybe I'll stop here and see if you have thoughts of comments or questions here.
I guess a question on that last point, how are you assessing how the parent is doing when the child is there for the weekend or there for, several days?
Well, of course, sometimes you're just going to talk to the parent, just ask them. But also, depending on the age of the child, you might also be able to talk to the child. That would also be a possibility. And sometimes it's going to be through the observation of behavior. So it's going to be, you're either going to have verbal conversations with people. Many of the kids, of course, depending on why they were in treatment in the first place, some of those kids are going to have therapists. Some of those kids are going to be in school settings. So you're going to be able to make some judgments around behavior and so forth. And so there isn't going to be a single way. There's going to be kind of a variety of ways. And remember, we're not expecting that a reunification is going to be perfectly smooth and hunky-dory and everything is going to be easy. That's not how things go in these kind of situations. There's going to be some rocky roads there, and just because a parent is having difficulty, that doesn't mean that the right answer is always to go placing the child again in care. I mean, we're really hoping that there's not going to be some other subsequent incident of abuse or something. I mean, we're really hoping that. And there does need to be, by the way, some check on that, either in terms of a conversation. Now, depending on the age of the child, if a child is very, very young, And we're very concerned about, so sometimes there need to be physician checks, depending on the age of the child and issues related to physical health. And so at times we need to do something like that. At other times, maybe we could enlist a public health nurse to give us some kind of an assessment of how the child is doing. And at other times, of course, it's going to be based on a discussion with the child herself or himself, which of course is always going to be more candid if the person doing the interview has a relationship with a child, as opposed to just visits occasionally on a once-a-month basis or something. So a lot of times sometimes kids are going to tell us with their words, but maybe more often they're going to tell us with their behavior, how they're actually doing there. So next time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to this issue of resources, because from a social policy standpoint, this is so important. And there's so many things that states and communities can do to support reunification and to make it more likely that it's going to work. And so next time, I want to, either next time or the month after, depending on when we come back to this subject, is going to come back and discuss this issue of both of social policy and what we can do to make it more likely that reunification is actually going to work as opposed to fail. And particularly for the very little kids. So I want to come back to this factoid that I started off with, that in this reunification study that was a national sample, more than 1/3 of infants were coming back into care within about a year. I mean, that's a very, very distressing piece of information. So we want to come back and think about, well, what can we do then to make that less likely to happen? And of course, part of the reason they're coming back into care is relapse. And that's not the only reason, but it's probably might be the single most important one. So we're going to come back next time and talk a little bit more about this subject, both from a public policy standpoint and from a therapeutic program kind of a standpoint. And I think with that, maybe I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Dee. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to do these for us on a monthly basis. We look forward to seeing you the next time around. So,
Okay, thanks.
thanks
Yeah.
everyone. Have a great
Yeah,
weekend.
thank you.